Hey everyone, Doug here with B&H. Today, for the first time, we're looking at two cameras from ZCAM. These are the ZCAM E2 and E2-S6. As you can see, both of them are pretty small, highly modular, and they're ideal for cinema capture. That's because these are cinema cameras first and foremost. There are some key differences between both units in terms of mount and sensor, but both of them produce rich, natural images with a variety of recording options, and they feature the connectivity that a cinema crew really demands. Best of all, the ZCAMs now support RAW recording, though for this video, we're actually going to take a look at ProRes RAW recording and why someone might want to use it for the best of both worlds. Here it is. Here we are. Behind me, as you can see, is Marsha Tratner. She is an artist and blacksmith and the owner of the space we're in right now, She Weld. And she's been gracious enough to let us come into the space, take a look at what's going on, see her in action at work. And basically what we're going to do today is grab the ZCAM E2-S6 and try to capture the space as beautifully as we possibly can. Now, as I said before, this video is about two ZCAM models, but today we're just going to look at the E2-S6, which is of course the EF mount 6K Super 35 version of the ZCAM. As you can see, this space is gorgeous. We have earthy tones, metal textures everywhere. There's going to be sparks and flames and also some tricky lighting situations. We have a lot of sunlight pouring in that we're trying to balance out, but at the same time, we do want to see how the camera holds up considering its dynamic range. Now, capturing that, we also have DZO lenses on board, and we're going to be recording everything to the Atomos Ninja V in ProRes RAW. Now, ProRes RAW recording is something that's been on the ZCAMs for a while, but the latest version of it does in fact allow you to do things like white balance adjustments. So that means that it's now a much more versatile, viable format to go out recording with. It takes up less space than the camera's native Z-RAW format and of course gives you pristine image quality to work with and an easier format to edit with. Internally, the cameras record to CFast 2.0 cards in H.264 or H.265 codecs, and with the latter option, you can record in 10-bit 420 color. Don't worry, we'll get into the recording specifics a little later. Both cameras require external monitoring, and while they can use Sony L-style batteries, which is what we did, I imagine many users will rig up a DC power solution. So while we have it here, before we really rig anything out, let's just take a look at the back real quick. As you can see, we have most of the connections all laid out here. There's the Sony L-style battery plate, and we have basically the HDMI port up top, LEMO auxiliary 12 volt, XLR, of course the remote right there, two general I/O ports, a screw-on Wi-Fi thread here, an Ethernet port, USB-C, and LEMO power. Now on the side here, we have the function buttons along with the power button and the card slot for CFast 2.0. There's only one on this camera. I will say the only thing I don't really like is this cover. I wish it was hinged. On the right side, we have our 3.5mm microphone and headphone jacks. And also you'll notice that around all of the camera really, there's 3 on this side, 5 on this side. There's 1/4 threads everywhere. There's also 1 on top and 2 on the bottom. So you can really customize and rig the ZCAM out almost infinitely. Now on the top here, things are also kept pretty simple. We have a very small LCD screen. This is mainly just for status indication along with the main menu control buttons. It does mean though that you don't need a separate monitor to at least configure the camera. You can't preview anything through here, but you can set everything up. You can see your settings, exposure values, stuff like that. Now you'll see here behind the mount, there's these little screws to change the mount. So you can actually switch this out from the EF to a micro four thirds mount or even a PL mount. Meanwhile, the E2 unit is the smaller of the two, based on a micro four thirds sensor and mount. As expected, that makes it a little lighter at only 1.67 pounds. But looking inside, the sensor itself is a little different from the E2-S6, being rated for 13 stops of dynamic range, but it can hit 16 stops in the wide dynamic range mode. Similar to the E2-S6, the bulk of the controls are located at the top of the camera, with status indicators located on the small LCD screen. On the right side, you have the CFast 2.0 slots as well, and on your left, your 3.5mm mic and headphone jacks, which, yes, is a reversal of the layout on the S6. The backside manages to pack most of the same connections as the S6 right down to the placement, but trades space for a serial control port. Like all ZCAMs, there's also a ton of quarter 20 threads all around this unit as well, meaning you can either directly attach many accessories to the camera or easily secure a camera cage, as we've done here. If there's any place the ZCAMs really excel, it's in the wealth of recording options. To be honest, there are more here than we even have time to cover, especially in regards to higher frame rate options, so we'll just list them here. Both cameras can record to H.265 in 10-bit 420, H.264 in 8-bit 420, and the aptly named Z-RAW format, all to CFast cards. But both cameras also support RAW output over HDMI, which can then be recorded as ProRes RAW, which we're doing here. External recording also opens up 10-bit 422 color options as well. The E2-S6 tops out at a stunning 6K 60 FPS capture internally, but can also capture DCI 4K up to 75 FPS and 1080p up to 120 FPS. On the other hand, the E2 tops out at 4K, but it can hit a stunning 160 FPS. 1080p can hit 240 FPS, making the E2 a very capable slow motion camera. Now, when it comes to the built-in ProRes 422 recording support, frame rate options are a little different with ProRes, as it depends on the data rate being used. So let's talk about lenses now. Right here I have the DZO Film Pictor Cinema Zoom. This is, of course, the 20 to 55 T2.8 lens, so great focal range right here. We actually have two zoom lenses today. We have this and we have the 50 to 125 T2.8. Oh, and let's not forget that since this is a cinema lens, we of course are dealing with a fully marked up lens. You have markings everywhere and everything has gears. So you have gears for the iris control, zoom ring, and focus ring, meaning you can put things on like a follow focus. Now, one small thing to note, this did by default come with a PL mount on it, and it does actually come in the box with an EF mount plate that you can put on. So you just take that off and put the EF mount on, and now it's basically an EF lens. So we're gonna pop it right on here. Again, this is a positive blocking situation. So unfortunately, we do not have a lens support, but this should take care of it. So we are about ready to shoot here, and just before we begin, let's go over our monitoring situation here. This is the Atomos Ninja V, which we're going to be using to not only monitor, but of course to record to ProRes RAW. Now we have a 500 gig mini SSD in the back here. We do have another one, and I'm kind of curious because recording times with RAW footage typically are not that high. It's a lot of data, especially for something that's only 500 gigabytes. However, this is ProRes RAW and not the camera's own internal Z-RAW. For those who don't have the drives or the budget to get the drives to shoot internally RAW, this could be a much better solution. Everything can be set up right here. So record, we can have our resolution set to 6K, project FPS, file format, time code. Under video, you get things like the variable frame rate option. Now under encoder, we have the camera's internal recording options. So we have H.264, H.265, or HEVC, which is the default here. And we have 4 flavors of ProRes, Proxy, LT, 422 regular, and 422 HQ. Below that, there's Z-RAW, which is the camera's internal recording. What we're looking for is in the record menu down here, RAW over HDMI. It's separate from the HDMI setting over in the system settings. Let's hit it on, and we'll see what that does. Our first look at RAW coming into the Atomos here. Let's go over to the menu here, see what's going on. So it does in fact see the ZCAM linear gamma and ZCAM RAW, so we know we're getting it correctly. As you can see here, we are seeing 5.8K, which is what they consider 6K on the camera, and it all seems to be working just fine. I haven't even set anything up really other than a simple iris change, and it already looks fantastic. We're gonna try to work on the exposure a little bit before we go into this, and of course, this is a preview, so don't take this as the final image. So one of the main reasons you would shoot RAW in general is for highlight retention and recovery. Now, as you can see, we have an open door, there's a window over there where light is just pouring in, and we like that for the most part, but it is a challenge. So right here, you can see through the monitor, I have a shot set up. I'm trying to keep this between a 4 and 5/6 split. Now, the artistic intent usually when you're shooting this way is to keep the aperture set to something intentional. You want it to be a certain way. You don't want to just close the iris down simply because you want to protect the highlights. So in this case, for example, I'm at right in the middle, 4 or 5/6 split. So I'm gonna try to live with these highlights and see how I can recover them later. Let's just roll on that. And now they're not terrible. The highlights on the leaves here are probably gonna be lost, but the window I think can be recovered. Now, if we go here to a full 5/6, we do gain some of it back. Again, still probably will wanna try pulling that back in post, but we're gonna see how that turns out later on when we've imported the footage. Aren't you a good boy? Yeah. Well, that was fun. Blacksmithing is something else. We got some great footage today, and my main concern though is what it's gonna look like in post. I wanna see, especially with the ProRes RAW recording, how we're gonna be able to pull up shadows, bring down the highlights, and adjust white balance as we need from shot to shot. That's, after all, the flexibility we're after here. And with a camera like this, a cinema camera especially, you want as much flexibility in the image as possible. Now, we didn't shoot in a lot of the formats today. We didn't go over slow motion, for example, but we did shoot everything in 6K RAW. So we're kind of getting the highest resolution you can get out of this sensor. So for those wondering, as a reference point, the 500 gigabyte SSD that we shot with today gave us about a 23-minute give or take recording time. And we were very frugal with our shot selection, so we didn't actually max out the card. But for those wondering, have a couple of those cards with you for the day if you plan on shooting, especially if you need to shoot a lot before you have a chance to dump your footage. So what we're gonna do next is take this footage over to a computer and see not only how the color and exposure hold up, but also how it performs on the computer. Can it cut fast? Can I scrub quickly through it? Overall, does it work? So after the shoot, I took all the footage into Adobe Premiere. These are still pretty large files over here, so to minimize any performance issues relating to read speeds, I copied everything over to a high-speed NVMe SSD. Now, before we do any adjustments to the footage, let's just see how it is scrubbing through the timeline with a few clips laid out. As you can see, it moves pretty fast. To be fair, this is on a reasonably high-spec computer, but performance like this is hard to believe for the kind of footage we're dealing with. Now let's take a look at color. As it is, you're probably thinking that this footage looks pretty average. There's blown out highlights and the color is mostly neutral with a tiny bit of magenta skew, if anything. If we go over to the master effects controls for a given clip though, we'll see the exposure setting and more importantly, the color space. Specifically, this is the output color space that the raw video gets transformed to. As we've discussed in other videos, Rec. 709 doesn't really have a lot of room for truly high dynamic range video, so this default appearance, as it were, is to be expected, and it does need some grading. But we're in luck. After all, this is ProRes RAW. First things first, let's knock down these highlights. Remember this shot? Here's the T5-6 part of that clip. Now in the ProRes RAW settings, I'm gonna knock down exposure by 1 stop. You can already see the highlights coming down on the scopes too, and we're actually able to recover everything. Though of course, we have to be careful here because we don't want to lose shadow detail either. I'm gonna bring this down to just where the highlights touch the top of the waveform. The leaves here are still clipped, but this is something we knew when we shot it thanks to the Ninja V. Next, I'll drop in a Lumetri color effect and do some simple white balance adjustments. Unfortunately, at this time, Adobe Premiere does not have ProRes RAW white balance adjustments, but Final Cut Pro 10 users should be able to adjust this on the RAW level. After that, I'll add a gentle S-curve to gain some contrast, and I've kept it simple here so that we can apply similar adjustments to all the footage. Now, what about a shot like this? The window is still blown out, but we can probably bridge the gap between the window and the interior by pulling the exposure down and boosting shadows in exchange. Going by the waveform, it looks like we can pull about 2 stops out of this. The window is clearly clipped, so when we go any lower, you can still see the hard line formed on the monitor. There's nothing more to recover here, but the blooming of the window has been reduced a lot. I've copied over our settings from the previous clip, and it's a pretty good start. I do want a sort of hazy sunlit appearance, which is how the space actually looks in person, but capturing that look did require us to fill in the shadows on set just a bit. By adjusting the curves only slightly, I'm pushing up the midtones and the shadows, but making sure that my highlights and black levels don't get crushed in the process. The result, in my opinion, is a beautifully cinematic image with minimal effort. I haven't done any specific color adjustments, and I haven't even changed saturation. I gotta say, the sensor here produced a lovely image. Another great example is this flared shot here. By the way, the DZO lenses that we used produce this awesome flaring from the window, but it still does look a little excessive here in terms of exposure. Bringing it 2 stops down, we can actually make out the plants in the back. So there's a lot going on here. As far as the ZCAM is concerned, we didn't dive too deep into its feature set or shoot in different frame rates and resolutions, but there were a few things that caught my eye on set. Going through the menu, you'll find numerous resolution options, color space options, and it's a surprisingly easy to navigate system overall. Admittedly, we had a very minimal setup here, but thanks to the multiple rigging points on the camera body itself, attaching the monitor was pretty much all we required. RAW over HDMI was unambiguously labeled, which I cannot overstate, and it presented no issues when connecting to the Ninja V. Speaking of the Ninja V, I've used this unit a few times before, but this was the first time I used it with the ZCAM, meaning I didn't really have any idea of how raw color and exposure might work between the devices. The good news is, RAW is RAW, and the Atomos unit picked up the signal after just a few moments, automatically setting itself to record ProRes RAW. Now, without any kind of dedicated LUT, the default Rec 709 conversion is simply too harsh, or by the books, if you will. I found that monitoring in PQ was the best way to gauge exposure here, as you can see everything that the sensor actually sees. Highlights are clipped not because of the color space limitations, but because they're actually clipped. This lets you make intentional decisions on what parts of the frame should be overexposed, such as the shine of metal or the sparks of a torch. One thing we didn't have time to test on set was the smartphone app for the ZCAM. I did try it here at home, and it worked pretty effortlessly. This version is still technically in early release, but it seemed to work without a hitch. The first thing you'll notice is the extremely low latency between the camera and the phone, which I'll be honest is completely unexpected for a wireless app. The preview alone is great to have, but seeing your settings up front like you would on a traditional camera LCD is comforting, to say the least. Everything can be changed through touch control, and you can even power the camera off from the top right corner. Touch the third button on the bottom, and overall project settings can be accessed with a slide-out menu on the right side. The rightmost buttons provide waveform monitors, false color view, zebras, and even LUT preview toggle. By the way, it works with both ZCAMs. Pretty nice. Well, that was a lot. The ZCAM series is exciting though. In many ways, it feels utilitarian in its approach, and I get that, but the resulting image quality is very nice, and the level of control that the camera grants you is amazing. Let's also not forget that there are some features here that are genuinely hard to find in many other cameras at this price point. The E2-S6 in particular has things like interchangeable lens mounts, no cropping in any of the resolutions or frame rates, extensive power and connectivity options, and both internal and external RAW recording options. Though the built-in LCD is minimal, the app support is surprisingly capable and makes up for much more than I expected it to. You can even record proxies to your phone. While we didn't get to shoot with the Micro Four Thirds E2 model, the similar feature set and design philosophy means that for users who want to dive into a truly cinematic shooting style, the E2 could be a fantastic place to start. Meanwhile, the E2-S6 gives even more control and possibilities to film crews who may need more from the lens mounting options. So that's it for the ZCAM E2 and E2-S6. I had a blast using it, and I was more than impressed with the resulting Ninja V monitoring and ProRes RAW workflow. Let us know what you think of the ZCAM series in the comments below. I'm Doug with B&H, and I'll see you next time.